Good evening and welcome. I am Susan Grew, the Programs Director for the Newport Beach Public Library Foundation. On behalf of the Foundation, I am pleased to welcome you all here to our final Library Live event of the season. This author lecture series is funded by private contributions as well as by the membership of the Foundation. I would like to thank the following sponsors for making the Library Live series possible: Chris and Debbie Gall, Karen Cool Jacoby, the Pacific Life Foundation, Jack and Katie Scholerman, Dr. Tom Staple, and Sam and Tammy Tang. Without their generous support, we would not be here tonight. Thank you all. A quick word about the foundation itself. The Newport Beach Public Library Foundation raises funds and purchases materials to support the Newport Beach Public Library. We are completely supported by our wonderful sponsors and by you, the members. For those of you who are our foundation members, and I see many of you out here tonight, I thank you. You are the ones that keep us going. For those of you who are not yet members, I invite you to join us tonight so that you can help us in our mission to maintain and grow this world-class library, and also to continue to bring intellectually stimulating programs like this one to our community. Please take a bookmark newsletter on your way out tonight. It contains a membership application as well as information about what the Foundation is doing. Final thanks goes out to our vendor sponsors who are here tonight. This includes our plaza neighbor, Baker and Olive, for donating their delicious savory offerings. Thank you, Ashley. In addition to catering, Baker and Olive offer private olive oil or wine and cheese tastings for groups of 5 or more, and their shop is located just a few doors down from us in the Plaza Shopping Center. Their staff is wonderful and friendly and so welcoming, and I invite you all to go down and meet them and see what they have to offer. And, of course, our independent bookseller, Susan at Laguna Beach Books. Thank you for being here. Ms. Danler will be signing books here at the book sales table at the conclusion of the program. I encourage you all to come up and buy a book and support one of our few remaining independent bookstores. And also be sure to visit Laguna Beach Books down at their bookstore in South Laguna Beach. And now, our program. Author Stephanie Danler is a Seal Beach native who went on to brave the harsh world of New York City restaurant life. She started writing her debut novel, Sweetbitter, while enrolled in the MFA program at the New School. Because the story draws on Ms. Danler's real-life experience, this book resonates with authenticity. It can be considered a peek behind the curtain of the theater that is fine dining restaurant service, but Sweetbitter is so much more than just a restaurant novel. It depicts the messy process of a young adult finding her way in the world. And I know that's a process we all can relate to. Stephanie, your book kept me captivated from beginning to end. And I know I'm not the only reader to feel this way. Sweetbitter became a New York Times bestseller the first week that it was released, and Stephanie was named one of the Orange County Register's 100 most influential people of 2016. Her book has been at high demand here in our library. Stephanie, we own 18 copies of Sweetbitter. And despite the number of copies we own, the wait list has been running over 100 people for the past year. So congratulations. And there's more to come. At the age of 33, Stephanie has a whole lifetime of writing ahead of her, and she is already at work on her second book. This one will be a work of nonfiction, and after reading a little bit about her real-life adventures, I am crossing my fingers that it is a memoir. We are pleased to bring this bright new author to you all tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephanie Danler.
What a beautiful crowd. I am so happy to be here. in my home state and towards the end of 2 months on book tour. And I guess I was in San Francisco yesterday, but we all know that doesn't count as California, not if you're from here. And this library is incredible. It's such an honor to be here. I was born in Long Beach and raised in Seal Beach, and I wish I had a space like this that brought so much culture to our beautiful little part of Southern California. So thank you. So Sweetbitter came out a year ago, and I have been touring more or less for the entire year. Generally, the way that I do this is I read for a little bit. Those of you who haven't read the book, it will give you a taste of my prose. That's a food pun because there's lots of food in the book. And then I talk a little bit about myself, my journey to writing, to restaurants, and how Sweetbitter came to be. And then I harass you to ask questions. I really love when this becomes a conversation. Every single night is different. Every single crowd is different. And if you guys just want to talk about food, or if you want to ask me weird personal questions, we can do all of that. So Sweetbitter follows a year in the life of a young woman, 22, who moves to New York City. She gets a job at a fine dining restaurant, loosely based upon a real restaurant in New York called Union Square Cafe. And I'll come to that later in the talk. She gets that job, and what follows I always see as her sentimental education. And we tend to think of sentimental educations as disillusionment stories, and also a series of firsts, whether it's your first love or your first friendship or your first attempt at intimacy or your first taste of champagne or your first time seeing truffles. So I'm going to read from the opening of the book to show you how she gets to the city, and then I'm going to read a passage of one of those firsts a few months later. You will develop a palate. A palate is a spot on your tongue where you remember, where you assign words to the textures of taste. Eating becomes a discipline, language obsessed. You will never simply eat food again. I don't know what it is exactly, being a server. It's a job, certainly, but not exclusively. There's a transparency to it, an occupation stripped of the usual ambitions. One doesn't move up or down. One waits. You are a waiter. It is fast money. Loose, slippery bills that inflate and disappear over the course of an evening. It can be a means to those with concrete ends and unwavering vision. I grasped most of that easily enough when I was hired at the restaurant at 22. Some of it was a draw. The money, the sense of safety that came from having a place to wait. What I didn't see was that time had severe brackets around it. Within those brackets, nothing else existed. Outside of them, all you could remember was the blur of a momentary madness. 90% of us wouldn't even put it on a resume. We might mention it as a tossed-off reference to our moral rigor, like enduring earthquakes or spending time in the army. It was so finite. I came here in a car like everybody else, in a car filled with shit I thought meant something and shortly thereafter tossed on the street. DVDs, soon to be irrelevant, a box of digital and film cameras for a still latent photography talent, a copy of On the Road that I couldn't finish, and a Swedish modern lamp from Walmart. It was a long, dark drive from a place so small you couldn't find it on a generous map. Does anyone come to New York clean? I'm afraid not. But crossing the Hudson, I thought of crossing Lethe, milky river of forgetting. And I forgot that I had a mother who drove away before I could open my eyes, and a father who moved invisibly through the rooms of our house. I forgot the parade of people in my life, as thin as mesh screens, who couldn't catch whatever it was I wanted to say to them. And I forgot how I drove down dirt roads between desiccated fields under an oppressive guard of stars and felt nothing. So let's say I was born in late June of 2006, when I came over the George Washington Bridge at 7 a.m. with the sun circulating and dawning, the sky full of sharp corners of light before the exhaust rose, before the heat gridlocked in, windows unrolled, radio turned up to some impossibly hopeful pop song. Open, open, open. So she gets a job, and then we have this a few months later. Where am I? After service, the dishwashers rolled up the sticky bar mats, and the smell of rot rose from the blackened grout in the tiles. The kitchen was a hollow amphitheater of stainless steel, still, but holding the after effects of the fires and banging and shouting. The kitchen boys were scrubbing every surface, rubbing out the night. 2 servers sat on a lowboy eating pickled red onions from a metal tin, leftover ice cream on the bread station, turning to soup. Hey, new girl, I'm in here. Me? Jake was in the doorway of a walk-in. He had a cup full of lemon wedges in his hand. His apron was streaked with wine, his shirt sleeves rolled high, and I could see his veins. Are you allowed to be in there? What I meant is, do you think about me the way I think about you? Did you like them, he asked. The oysters? When he said the word oysters, their flavor flamed on my tongue, as if it had been lying dormant. Yes, I think I do. Come in here. His tattoos showed themselves as he pressed the door open wider. I passed under his arm, looking back to make sure no one was watching. I'd never been in any space alone with him. Are we going to get locked in? What I meant is, I'm scared. Inside, there were 2 open beers, the Schneider Weiss Aventinus, a bottle I'd pulled for the bar but never tasted. The beers were propped against a cardboard box labeled greens but filled with little neck clams. We were in the seafood closet. Crimson tuna fillets, marbled salmon sides, snowy cod. The air nipped at my skin, smelling like the barest trace of sea. Jake dug through a wooden crate labeled with masking tape, Kumamoto's. He pulled out 2 tiny rocks, discarded the debris that clung to the outside. A strand of seaweed stuck to his pants. They look filthy, I whispered. They're a secret, he said, quite a leap of faith. His voice was quiet with the motor of the fridge, and I involuntarily shivered and moved toward him. He pulled a blunt knife out of his pocket, wedged the tip into an invisible crack, 2 switches of his wrist, and it was open. Where'd you learn to do that? He pinched a lemon over it and said, Take it quickly. I flipped the shell back. I was prepared for the brininess, for the softness of it, for the rigidity and strangeness of the ritual, adrenalized, fiercely private. I panted and opened my eyes. Jake was looking at me and said, "They're perfect." He handed me the beer. It was nearly black, persuasive as chocolate, weighty. The finish was cream. It matched the oyster's creaminess. The sensory conspiracy made the blood rush to my head, my skin break out in goosebumps. Ignore him. Look away. I looked at him. Can I have another? And that is how you get into trouble at restaurants. For the rest of the textbook, you may purchase it right after tonight's event. Oh, Jake, what a nightmare. There is a cliche that all first novels are autobiographical. And when I started this journey, I was really defensive about it. I felt somehow that it belittled my ability to create. All of the work I had done imagining this world and this restaurant and this plot, and people were just going to tell me that I'm Tess for the rest of my life. That's the name of my protagonist. People assumed that I kept a diary of my work experience, and I resented it. And at this point, a year later, I'm very comfortable with how autobiographical Sweetbitter is. I'm maybe even proud, because turning life into art is a mysterious alchemical process. And somehow I distilled almost 17 years in the restaurant industry into a book that's entirely its own, even if it is based on a lot of my life. Tess, who we just met coming over the bridge and getting into trouble in the refrigerator, she inherited a lot from me. She got my age when I moved to New York City. She got the year, 2006. 2006 is important for a couple reasons. First, I think when you move to a city, that moment, whether it's 1976 or 2014, the city is stamped on you. That's the map that you always refer to. And the trouble with cities is that they're constantly changing. That map is irrelevant within 6 months. It produces this strange nostalgia where New York for me is always frozen in this moment, right before the new condos were built in Williamsburg, and before Mars Bar closed, or before the restaurant I worked at, Union Square Cafe, couldn't afford to be in Union Square anymore. The other benefit of 2006 is the iPhone came out in the summer of 2007. And I ended my novel right before that. It's interesting because often people will tell me that this feels like an older New York, and I've identified it because as being the smartphone culture that we live in now. In the book, if you can't find a cab, you're in trouble. End of story. You have to keep walking. If you and your friends are arguing at the bar over a piece of Civil War trivia, whoever is most sober is going to win that argument. If you can't find the person that owes you money, you have to call and walk around town and take action. And I find I do not know the novelist, I have yet to see it, that can tackle the iPhone because it obliterates action. So I don't have to worry about any of that in this book. Tess also gets my terrible first apartment. It was a slum, essentially. I called it out by address in the book, 220 Roebling, much to my landlord's shame, I'm sure. But the most autobiographical aspect of Sweetbitter is that Tess gets a job that she thinks will be temporary. She thinks that I'm going to get a restaurant job and make a little money, and then my real life will start. I did the same thing. And what happens in the book also happened to me, which is that I fell head over heels in love with the restaurant industry. I look back at getting hired by Danny Meyer. He built Union Square Cafe in 1985. It's a landmark restaurant as far as being the first restaurant that people would travel from all over the city to go to, but also because of the way he changed hospitality. What I found when I got there was that he had professionalized and legitimized an industry that still struggled with a lot of stigmas, namely the stigma that you had failed at something, and that's why you ended up in a restaurant. Danny was the first person to offer health benefits to his employees. The servers I met there had 401ks, they owned homes, they got hourly raises if they stayed, meaning they were making six figures. They had kids and thriving lives, and because Danny created such a warm, supportive environment, they had all been there for 20 years. I worked with several people that had been there since 1985, and whether they went to go show paintings in Berlin or on tour with their band, they always came back to Union Square. Now that is a real revolution in an industry that runs on disposable labor. Danny was building something else, and it's also a very smart and affordable way to run a business because you're not constantly hiring new people and you're not constantly training. What you're building, what he's trying to build, is a family. And that's what I found at Union Square Cafe. I could have been hired at TGI Fridays, maybe, if they hired me. I could have gotten a job as a cocktail waitress and worn a little black dress and made probably twice as much money. And I look back, and as I've been talking for this past year about the journey, I've identified it as a hinge moment, meaning there were several paths available, and I chose this one, and my life hinged there. A door closed behind me, and I wasn't going to be just a waitress. I was going to be a server at Union Square Cafe. Within a year and a half of working there, I had fallen in love with wine and decided to go to wine school. I did 2 years at the WSET, which is the Wine and Spirit Education Trust. During that time, I was tapped to help open a wine store with a woman, Monty Dawes, who had several other businesses, and she was really impressed by my curiosity and the growth that she had seen in me while I was pursuing these certificates. So when I was 25, she let me be in charge of her wine bar beverage program. This is like the baby of the restaurant group. It was literally the least amount of responsibility, but I loved it. I loved designing a wine list. I loved walking the floor at night, just talking to people about wine and travel and making their meal really shine. And that's what beverage service can do. It can take a meal where we just need food because we're hungry, and it can take it to the next level. By the time I was 26, I was the wine director for all of her restaurants and the wine store. I taught wine education to groups that ranged from 100 to 150. I planned lists for restaurants that specialized in Spanish wine and southern restaurants that specialized in bourbon but still needed a wine list. I got lessons from master winemakers and master scotch makers, and they would come to our restaurants and teach. My travels during that time were solely based around eating and drinking, and I was going through Europe and Southeast Asia. We opened 2 more restaurants with that group, and I was very involved, and opening a restaurant is like a suicide mission, but I lived both times, barely the second time. We're coming to that. And I loved my life. I lacked for nothing. It was an incredibly fulfilling existence. And on the weekends, I would go to obscure boroughs in New York looking for Chinese restaurants that served live octopus, even though it was illegal. And that was my cult. And I lived for taste. And at this point, I'm about to turn 30. And we are looking at spaces for a wine store, my wine store. After the 7 years that I had been with Moni, she was going to give me sweat equity in a store. My name would be on the lease. And it felt like I was hitting the pinnacle of my career. This was why I worked 70 hours a week. I never had 2 days off in New York City, ever, the entire time I lived there. This was what I had sacrificed for. And every time we went into a space and I left, I had a very tangible and pervasive heaviness in my chest. And I began to call it the despair, like a real existential despair, like something was wrong and I couldn't name it. So I just was like, oh, it's just the despair. And I thought maybe it was change. Change is scary. I thought maybe it was commitment. Signing a lease is scary. But I knew what it really was, because running next to that resume I just gave you, that was my New York resume, more or less, there was another story, another narrative, and that was my life as a writer. As soon as I could read, I started to tell stories. When I was 8 years old, this is true, this is the true story. When I started this, they told me not to tell this story. It's about to get weird. I'm really good at listening. So when I was 8 years old, Edgar Allan Poe was my favorite writer. I loved his poetry, and I loved the gothic goriness of his short stories. And I decided I was going to write my own Edgar Allan Poe short story about a girl that goes to a slumber party and gets inhabited by a spirit and then kills herself. And it was illustrated. Kitchen knife. I went to Catholic school at St. Hedwig's down the road. I was in Sister Bernadette's office like that. And they called my mom. She couldn't leave work. So my grandmother came to pick me up. And I thought, oh, I'm in so much trouble. I was like, it's a good story though, right? Like, do you like my illustrations? I was very proud of it. And my grandmother said, read me the book. And we were up in Palos Verdes where she lived. And very clearly, I remember finishing, and we were at a stoplight, and she looked at me and she said, you are a writer. Never stop writing. And the book is dedicated to my grandparents, even though they will never read it. My grandfather took one look at the cursing in the middle of the book, and he was like, nope, not for me. So I knew I was a writer. It's the only thing I ever wanted to do. And when I was 15, I went out and got a restaurant job, because that's what writers did. I knew that restaurants were the place that artists could support themselves and support their creative time. It was a place where the time to money ratio would always fall in my favor. And what I found when I became a hostess at Walt's Wharf in Seal Beach at 15 was, number one, someone palmed me $50 to move them to the top of the list. And I said, this is the greatest job in the world. Thank you, I will take that. And I looked at the servers around me, and they were all striving and ambitious, and they were all artists. And they knew so much about the world, and they did drugs, and they flirted with each other. And I thought, these are my people. These crazy, hypersensitive, creatives are my clan. At the same time, I was a creative yet hypersensitive adolescent, and I had a troubled academic transcript. I'm being very polite right now. I was more than slightly rebellious. And my mother decided to send me to school in Colorado, to a school that would kind of turn me around. And one day, my English teacher calls me after class, and I'm like, oh, I'm in trouble again. At this point, I'm very used to being in trouble. This is like going to Sister Bernadette's office. And he said, you're a writer. Did you know that? And I said, yeah, I do, actually. Again, I had a path, and I was in a lot of trouble. And I would have sorted it out, but it might have taken me longer if I was not seen and recognized in that moment. My life hinged there. But I still couldn't get into college. Obviously, I got rejected from every single college. Long Beach State, state schools in Colorado, because of this transcript, even though my test scores were strong. And I was a barista, still in the restaurant industry. Never had another job my entire life. And my friends started to graduate from this fancy school. And they were like, I'm off to MIT, I'm off to Dartmouth. And I was like, what's MIT? Wait, where is everyone going? And I called an aunt. And I said, I have been waitlisted at one school. And it's a school for writers. And it's in a state called Ohio. That I would never think I would ask this in my life, but will you please take me to Ohio? I flew out. I interviewed with the dean of admissions, the dean of the English department. I sent them every short story I had ever written. And the last week of May, I had graduated in early May. This was a very stressful few weeks. I was accepted to Kenyon College. And I felt that confirmation that my writing was going to see me through. And so when I moved to New York City, I had a novel also about New York. As soon as I was 18, I started to work there in the summers in coffee shops. After I left California at 16, I never came back here for more than a week. I knew that New York was the place for me because that's where artists went. And that is where they got the life experience. And that was where everything happened that you could write about. And I had a novel that also had a ton of cocaine in it. Yikes. And my friends from Kenyon took internships or assistant jobs. They were making $20,000, maybe $24,000. And I thought, oh, no. I'm just going to go to restaurants and I'll sell my book. And that's when Danny hired me. Within 6 months at Union Square Cafe, I was not saying, but I'm a writer. I said, no, I'm a restaurant person. It was so quick. But I didn't stop writing. I have a handwriting practice. And I still wrote every morning. And it's nonsense. It's like, I'm anxious, I'm sad, it's sunny, it's terrible, but it's what I do and I've been doing for my entire life. But somewhere along the line, those years walking the floor, talking to people, teaching my servers, I'd come up with an idea for a novel. And the original impulse for Sweetbitter was to write a book that I didn't see, a book that did not exist yet, that I wanted to read. I was really interested in the genre of coming of age because I so rarely saw a woman who was coming of age, whose story didn't look like a fairy tale. I would think about the books I wanted to be in conversation with or writing against. And I would think of Henry James, who wrote Portrait of a Lady, which I adore, and he created arguably the greatest heroine of the 20th century. But we're never in her body. We're never close to her pleasure or her anxiety or her fear. It's a very cool, distant Jamesian, third omniscient. And I would think about Catcher in the Rye, one of my favorite books when I was a kid. What happens when a girl runs away to New York City? I thought about Portrait of an Artist as a young man and the nobility that Joyce gives the male journey towards personhood. And I thought, why are there no 22-year-old women in the media that aren't a joke, that aren't treated as if they're superficial or lacking in integrity? Where is the piece of art that shows what an incredibly pure time of life that is, when you have your autonomy, but you have no concept of consequences? It's the only time in your life where your actions are not premeditated to be in line with the life that you want. They're not aspirational. It's just want. I want more life. I think that combination of having the power to get your own credit card, go home with a stranger, get fired from your job, get another job, that combined with the lack of wisdom that comes from responsibility produces a free fall, but it can be a really gorgeous free fall. I wanted to write a female narrative that did not end with a boyfriend or a job promotion or a wedding. I wanted to write about a woman who wasn't an innocent and didn't get thrown into trouble and didn't get rescued, but perhaps was damaged and self-destructive and perhaps wasn't rescued at the end. And in the same vein, I wanted to write against the restaurant books that I knew. In the years from 2006 to when I started writing this, we've seen an explosion of restaurants in the media, but over and over again, it's the same view. It is the hyper-masculine, testosterone-driven Anthony Bourdain kitchen culture with the knives and the tattoos and the banging and shouting and the fires. But my restaurant wasn't like that. The world I lived in, my world was incredibly sensual and delicate. And what I taught people, and also the way I lived my life, was about slowing down to taste something. And once you do that, once you're not thoughtlessly consuming, but you're spending time with a wine, that attention to detail ripples through your entire life. It changes the way you listen to music. It changes the way that you walk. It changes the way that you notice light. I did not see that restaurant anywhere in the hundreds of reality television shows and the hundreds of chef memoirs. But if any one of you has a friend who is 30 years old and tells you they want to quit their very stable job and they're on the verge of opening a business and go into a ton of personal debt to go back to graduate school because they have an idea for a book that doesn't exist yet, you would do well to be terrified. And I was. I applied to graduate school in secret, which is not a nice thing to do to your business partners or your partner, but I could not even have the conversation. So if I get in, we'll do this, because it seemed so impossible, so foolish, and so irresponsible. So when I got in, I had just left Tia Paul, which is a restaurant in Chelsea that I was managing at the time. And I had missed a call from the new school. I called them back. They welcomed me. They gave me a very generous scholarship. And I was standing in the street, and all I could hear in my head was the last line of a Rilke poem. The poem is The Archaic Torso of Apollo, which is a pretty classic poem. It's about a man looking at a fragment of a sculpture in a gallery. And the first 3 stanzas are really typical. He's trying to describe it, and because it's Rilke, it's like so interesting the way that he describes it, and it's beautiful. But most great poems have a switch, a flip that occurs, and it can just be a surprising word. But this one occurs in the last stanza, and after multiple stanzas of him looking at the work of art, at the end, he feels seen by the art. Then he feels penetrated by it. And the last line is, "You must change your life. You must change your life. You must change your life." And I think I've had so much time to think about why that poem was with me at such an important moment. And I think it's about the move from being passive to taking action. We all encounter beautiful works of art all the time. They don't penetrate us in that way where we have to do something about it. But at that moment, I'd been thinking about Sweetbitter for years, and I was done being passive, and it was time for me to change my life. And so I went back to graduate school. I left my job, and my identity and relationships quickly disintegrated right after. I like to talk about the risk. The other night I was in Oakland, and a young girl said, "You're like a poster girl for high risk, high reward." And that comment says more about her than it does about me, but I thought, it wasn't glamorous. Sweetbitter, because I'm on this crazy book tour and you guys are all holding my beautiful book in your hand, it feels like it was inevitable, but it wasn't. And the line between success and failure is so razor thin. And I went into graduate school with that failure so hot on my back, and I can still feel it now, even though I should feel safe. It was so scary to take this risk. And so when I got to school, I worked like a maniac. I did not write anything else in graduate school except for Sweetbitter. I looked around and everyone else was 23 and their parents were probably paying for their MFA, and I thought, you guys can make new short stories every week, or you can try science fiction if you feel like it. I have to have a manuscript. I have to have something finished and tangible at the end of this, or it will have been not only a poor investment, but a personal failure. And so at the end of 2 years, I turned in Sweetbitter, and it was the longest thesis anyone had ever submitted. I was thrilled. There's like a thesis board of very famous novelists, and I kept saying to people, I was like, it's free editing, free readers, like to get feedback. And then someone was like, you think this is free? And I was like, oh yeah, it's very expensive editors. But you have these illustrious, incredibly talented, generous authors at your disposal for 2 years. And so I tried to use them. I was at every office hours. I wanted to know what agents they knew. I wanted to understand everything about the book publishing industry. And so when I graduated, I had a book. Good job, Stephanie. Very exciting, except that to go back to school, I obviously couldn't work with my company anymore, and I couldn't work 6 days a week. I had gone back to waiting tables, which was a very disheartening demotion. I had a legitimate 20-year-old girl training me saying, "This is Chardonnay. It's from France." I said, "Oh, okay, I'm gonna kill myself, or I'm gonna kill you and then myself." And every night the servers would go off to their after hours bar and they'd be like, "Bye, Grandma." And I was like, okay. My fingers hurt, my teeth hurt, my Achilles tendon hurt, my back hurt. Managing a restaurant, owning restaurants, is very hard, and it's a 24-hour-a-day job. It does not touch the physicality involved in waiting tables, all of which I had conveniently forgotten. And so when I graduated from my program, I was a waitress with a manuscript. There are tons of us in New York City. And so this anxiety, this fear was still driving me. And I started to submit the book to agents, which is what you have to do to get published. And I got a lot of rejection, but one woman read it overnight and had me in her office the next day. And I said, "You are the person I want on my team. If you respond to my sentences with this kind of urgency, we're meant to be." And she said, "We're going to send the book out in 2 weeks to publishers." And we were going to send it out on a Thursday. And on Tuesday night, I was working at Buvette in New York's West Village. And I was opening my wine like I do every night of the week. And I'm waiting on a regular of mine that I've been waiting on for 2.5 years. But because the book was about to really see the light of day, I looked at Peter and I said, "Aren't you an editor?" And he said, "Yeah, I've been at Random House for 36 years. I was like, "Oh my God, that's so funny because I'm a writer." Plastered smile, dead inside. That's Peter. And I said, "Yeah, and I have a novel." And he's just not saying anything. Crickets. And I said, "My agent is Mel Flashman, and we're sending it to Doubleday and Hachette and Bloomsbury and Penguin and blah, blah, blah." And he was like, "Oh, this is real." He very generously said that he would take a look at it. And then it was my turn to freeze because I thought, oh my God, he's going to hate it. He is an old school publishing legend, but like a dude. And my novel is poetic, experimental, comes from like a deep-seated femininity. That's the point of it. I thought, oh my God, he's gonna. Both of us left thinking, we'll never see each other again. Like, he can sit in a different section. We sent it to him on Thursday. On Friday, he wrote me and said that he was blown away, and he asked for a meeting. Knopf was my 7th meeting. And I had had some great ones with incredibly famous and talented editors, but with a lot of people that said, let's just make this a little bit more like Lena Dunham. Like, let's just kick up the sex a little bit. Or let's make this more like Kitchen Confidential. Or let's lose the love story and do more restaurant stuff. And I would think, what book are you reading? Like, they would see book about restaurant and just start writing a whole new book in their head. And I got to Knopf, and it was an incredible meeting with what I think is the most talented team in publishing. But a woman was sitting next to me, and she said at the end, she'd been quiet the entire time, she said, "This book really reminded me of Portrait of a Lady. I thought it was a bit Henry James." And I said, oh my God, the only other person alive that has read Henry James, I found you. I almost cried. They saw the book that I was trying to write. And at the end of the meeting, Peter looked at me and presented me with a bottle of Premier Cru Burgundy, and he said, "This is for you to open when you sell Sweetbitter, because nothing bad is going to happen to this book." And as long as I stay off the internet, he was totally right. The next day, I signed a 2-book deal with Knopf, and 3 months later, I stopped waiting tables. The end. And I would love to answer any questions you have about any of that. Yes, sir.
Our daughter is planning on to New York in September for culinary school.
Terrifying. Keep going, yes.
She's also very romantic, she's very sensitive, she doesn't like to follow the rules. So, and we have a restaurant, so she has a few years restaurant experience.
Oh my goodness. Mm-hmm. Very much so. Three what? What? Oh. So their daughter is going to culinary school in Manhattan, and they own a restaurant, and they would like 3 words of advice. And the only thing that comes to mind is to stay hydrated. I can't hear you, I'm sorry. Yeah, stay hydrated. That's all I can say. Yes, hi.
I haven't read your book, but I enjoyed Gabrielle Hamilton, and there seems to be a lot of parallels.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have mentors besides Danny Meyer, who now has gone to train in the South, Walk South, but did he be still in your picture, and is Gabrielle part of a woman's mentorship?
Yeah, I've had incredible food mentors, actually. And after Danny, I only worked for women. I applied to Prune, Gabrielle Hamilton's restaurant. She did not call me in for an interview. We've talked about that recently. Danny has been really supportive. And I think it was a little scary for a minute because my book, the restaurant in my book, looks a lot like Union Square Cafe, but it's not. That's the benefit of writing a novel. I can throw in something that happened in Seal Beach and something that happened in Ohio. And the one time we all found a cockroach frozen in an ice cube in the ice machine. Like, if that happens to you, you have to put it in your book, which never happened at Union Square Cafe. And so that's a little tricky. And I think that overall, this book is such a love story to the restaurant industry that was my saving grace with him, and he's been immensely supportive. I don't think he can quite stomach reading it. There are a lot of drugs and bad behavior I don't think he wants to know about. But another chef besides Gabrielle is Jody Williams, who owns Bouvette. Monty Dawes, who owns Tia Paul in Maysville and Char Number 4. I worked for her for so many years. There were so few women in the kitchen and even fewer women in the wine world, and I always gravitated towards them. They tended to be terrifying women, just took no nonsense. And I'm much more of a pleaser and a waitress in that way, but these entrepreneurs and chefs, I wish I could continue to channel them. Incredible, the strength it takes to have a successful restaurant in New York. Let's start here and we'll move back.
That's a rather unusual place, I would think, to start in New York, since it was one of the top restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
How did that happen?
Well, I had experience. I started when I was 15. I have more experience than the character in my book does. But Danny's famous for his concept of the 51 percenter. And what that is, 49% of the job, anyone can do it. It's the mechanics. It's refilling the water. It's taking the menus. It's entering the order in at the right time. Robots couldn't do it and probably will do it in a few years. 51%, he always says, you cannot train. You have to hire them when you see them. And he breaks it down really well in his book and in the training manual. But after all these years, I think it's empathy, an extra sense of empathy and an ability to give care. He didn't, but the general manager did. And then at orientation, he meets everyone in the company and knows their name, knows their story, and shakes their hand. And I have so many good things to say about him as a businessman and working for him. I'm in the cult. I have nothing bad to say about it. But I think that I was hired based on this quality that he looks for, which is an ability to give care and compassion. I'll go there and we'll go around. Yes.
You have a two-book deal, so you're going to be writing another book, but I'm also curious about where you want to go next on your culinary path.
Great question. Sweden. I'm very interested in Sweden. I just did Peru. I write travel and leisure, travel journalism, and I did Sicily and Peru recently. I did Thailand last year as well, and the seafood in Sweden I find really appealing, and there are restaurants that are cooking with dirt and pine needles on the plate, and I'm just interested in what's happening there. It's not a typical... Yes, absolutely. Micro terroir, absolutely. Yeah. But what am I doing next? I'm going to Spain next. So boring, but I love it. Yes. I am. I mean, I could be hired as one at a restaurant. I was always a beverage director or a wine director, and all that means is that you do stuff behind the scenes, like look at P&Ls, profit and loss sheets, manage the beverage cost. A SOM is usually a service-specific figurehead. He works service and sells wine to tables, which I definitely do. He, she, come on. Equality. Somewhere over here, right there.
You seem so young to have accomplished as much as you have. Did you actually spend 4 years in Ohio in college?
I sure did. I sure did. I'm turning 34. I mean, I've had these lives, right? And when you start in the restaurant industry at 15, the experience racks up. In 2006, the 2 days after I graduated, I drove in over the George Washington Bridge. Yep.
When I read the book, I had no idea. I knew nothing about you. I was just reading the book, and as I was reading, I said to myself, this person has read the classics extensively. Have you read, is that something you always did, read classics, or do you read classics?
I forgot I'm supposed to repeat the question. You guys should have yelled at me. She asked if I had read the classics. And Kenyon was an incredibly classical education. We did not study anything past 1920. T.S. Eliot was modern. I mean, he's considered a modernist. But more than that, Milton, Spencer, Chaucer, Dante in both languages, Homer, It is a kind of education that makes no sense, is so irrelevant in many ways, but I find it so valuable. And then when I had the decision in graduate school between Columbia and the new school, I knew I wanted the new school because it focuses on the avant-garde and experimental. And I wanted to read Nabokov, and I wanted to read Foucault and all the theory that I had missed at Kenyon. But I'm very grateful that I can read Henry James for pleasure, or Tolstoy, or Flaubert. It's a skill that children are not being taught anymore. The sentences are too complex, and you can't read it in 5 minutes before bed or on the train. It harkens back to a time when reading was an activity. Like, I'm going to go play golf today. I'm going to go read today for 4 hours, and that is how I'm spending my time. And it's so hard now because of the little machine that broke our brain. But I still try to treat reading like a job and like an activity. Right next to you, yeah.
I loved your character, Howard and Simone.
Mm-hmm.
And did you have an interview that was like the interview that Howard gave you?
She asked about the interview scene, which comes right after what I read you tonight, by the general manager, Howard. No, that scene was so hard to write. I rewrote it about 100 times because this character has no backstory. That interview scene, when you first see her in action, responding, and the power struggle that's going on between a man that is in charge and a young woman who doesn't want to rely on her sexuality but thinks that might be her only currency, the power struggle there is so delicate. And everything she said had to tell you all about her character. I had an interview at Union. I had 4 interviews at Union Square Cafe in order to get hired. They were a lot more playful. This one was very serious.
And what about Simone? Did you know a Simone, or is she a composite figure?
She is a composite. Simone is Tess's mentor at the restaurant. She is the woman. She's approaching 40. She's been there since the early 20s. She's the one who has stayed too long at the party. But she's also the fountain of knowledge, and she's a sommelier. And her affection for Tess is, in one way, very pure, and in another way, very toxic. I never knew anyone like Simone. She is a composite. Henry James does these triangles very well. It's also in Dangerous Liaisons, where there's the older figure who may or may not be manipulating the younger innocent that trusts her. And to me, I always saw those relationships as maternal, as very fraught maternal relationships, where someone pulls you in, but also will hurt you just as quickly. And so Simone speaks like poets that I love. Her voice is informed by the poetry that I read. And she's so much fun to write because there's no one like her. Over here.
How'd you come up with the title?
Sweetbitter. Sappho, the ancient Greek poet, was the first person to call love bittersweet. All we have left of her poems are fragments, but that's on one of the fragments in reference to love. And for centuries, we've been translating it like that. The poet Anne Carson is a classic scholar, and she translated Sappho's poems. And she wrote a book about that process. And she looked at the Greek, the actual Greek word, and she said, we've had it wrong. The order in Greek is sweetbitter, and that is also the order of love, sweet and then bitter. And I find when you're writing a book, how did that book appear right before I started school? And I knew that was the title of my book. I never wavered. You go to graduate school and some kid every week was like, I don't know about the title. I'm like, I don't want to talk about the title. It's the title. And so I have her quoted, Sappho, translated by Anne Carson. I have it quoted at the beginning of the book. Back row?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the despair.
Mm-hmm.
I like that so much. I can relate to it more than you know. And with that, like when you're pursuing your dream, what you feel you're meant to do, not doing that is essentially like committing spiritual suicide in a sense to me.
That's what Kierkegaard says, actually. He's talking about despair. I'm just going to say what you're saying. He's talking about the despair I was speaking of earlier, and how to not be pursuing what you're called to do or what you feel you should be doing is like committing spiritual suicide. Keep going.
Yeah, I'm a writer and I've got a million questions I'd love to ask. But a few of them, they come off the top of my head. Right now I just finished my first draft, right, of this novel that
He finished his first draft of his novel.
for a year and a half. How long did it take you to write your novel, and how many revisions did you actually go through before you felt you had a completed manuscript?
How long did it take me to write my novel? How many revisions did I go through? And how long until I felt that I had a complete manuscript? I'll answer that one first. Never. Was revising this as I read it tonight. At a certain point, someone will tell you that you're done, and you'll feel done. You'll feel that you can't look at the book anymore. Revising is so difficult because the sentences become leaden when you work them over. And in that first rush, when they come out, they feel like electricity. But to work on the same sentences, you will develop a palette for years. It's hard to keep yourself in love with your work. I wrote the first draft of Sweetbitter in 2 years, but that was while I had 2 jobs and coursework. And I edited with an editor intensely full-time for 6 months. And I consider that I wrote 3 complete drafts of the book. The first draft that I finished was non-linear, meaning that it would jump from like spring to winter to summer, and they were linked by motif, but it was so experimental that it was hard on the reader. And that was one of the first things my editors changed. They said, stick the seasons together. Put chapters in. I was like, chapters? Oh my God. No, that is so boring. Once I started, it made the novel so much better. And I'm happy to admit that. That's why you pick an editor. That's why you choose these people, because they're going to be forming this with you. So I think 3 years, all told, of work. You are halfway there. Actually, finishing the first draft is the most important part. You don't know what you have until you get to the end of the first draft, and you can hold it all in your mind. So congratulations. Yes, hi.
In doing your first book, I would imagine there's some sense of freedom. You're not facing deadlines. You're not
Oh, yeah.
working at your own pace. You're experiencing things. Now that you've got a 2-book deal, and I'm sure you have deadlines and timelines, how do you then go from that freedom experiential writing process into now the pressure, especially after a very successful first book, into the next one?
Her question was about the difference between writing this book, and I'm going to paraphrase you, but with freedom, with no deadlines, not knowing if you were ever going to have an audience. I'm putting words in your mouth, but to now I'm working on my second book, and I have deadlines, and I have to negotiate with editors about it before I've written it, and I have an audience and expectations. I was so anxious during the writing of Sweetbitter and so scared that I did not realize that it was easily the happiest time of my life. I thought I was going to be a waitress forever. I thought that I had taken on all of this debt that would cripple me for the rest of my life. I thought I had made nothing but bad decisions. And there were 4 weeks at a writer's residency, which is an incredible resource. You should apply to writer's residencies. What they are fellowships that are awarded to you where you go and you live in the woods in a beautiful cabin, and they bring your food to you, and they make all your meals. If you come up to me afterwards, I'll give you my short list. I had one, but I wasn't published yet. But it was the first time I felt like an artist, and I had 4 weeks, and I had just graduated from school, and I had gotten the restaurant to give me the time off, and it was the most glorious time of my life. But not knowing that this was coming, that I was gonna sell it, that people would read it or respond to it positively, that's really crippling. It's a weird state to live in. And I see when I go and teach writers, I want to be like, you have it all right now. You're going to publish your book and you're never going to write again. You're going to be on tour for years. But I know the anxiety and the fear is so loud. So it wasn't that free. It is really, really different now. I think in order to write, you have to be fairly adept at shutting out other people's voices, and I've honed that skill. But it's more talking about a book before I've written it. Having to talk to my editors at Knopf on how many pages I'm at, and talking to people at my readings about what it's about, giving this tagline for it when I don't fucking know what it is. Oh, good, so close to not cursing. I have no idea what it's about, really. I have been working on it in little bits and pieces as I've been touring, but I haven't gone into it yet. I could change my mind tomorrow. That has been interesting and really different. But yeah, I wish there was a way to enjoy that freedom when you have it, but I guess we're not meant to.
And Stephanie, I think we have time for one more question.
Give it to me, guys. What's it? Front row or second row?
So first of all, I'm very happy 2017 because I found you, so I hope I found.
That's true.
I'm very happy actually here tonight, so thank you very much for sharing. So I was curious. I've been traveling all my whole life, and moved actually from New York to California, and that's when I started writing again. I've been a writer in the closet for the longest time. I was curious, once you moved from California to New York to Ohio, did geography change your creative process and your writing process?
I will. She has moved from New York to California, and she started writing again. She was a writer in the closet. I'm gonna steal that. I love that. I was writing in the closet all those years. And whether my movement from New York to Ohio to California, or being from California, has changed my writing. No one has ever asked me that. First of all, congratulations. And my writing, I'm realizing it right now, is so tied to New York. And it always has been. When I was in Ohio, I wanted to be in New York. I took every opportunity to be there. When I was living in Colorado and here, I subscribed to The New Yorker when I was 14, and I read the entire thing. I would read the talk of the town, and I would think, this is where life is. I had this mental map of the city, and so my writing's home has always been New York, but strangely, I'm not able to write there anymore. And I don't know what that is, whether completing Sweetbitter was the end of a chapter. I've recently moved back to LA, and now I'm based out of LA. And I find that California is starting to change my writing. But still, I feel like a New York writer. I wonder if that will go. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being such a generous crowd.
Thank you all for coming, and Stephanie, thank you. We welcome you back for when your book gets published.
We'll all be very old by then. But I'll try my best, guys.
I invite you to come up and partake of book sales and signing. Thank you all.